In the quiet hush of a medieval morning, long before church bells called villagers to life, and long before the sun warmed the cold stone walls of the countryside, a simple question drifted across the centuries like wood smoke rising from a hearth. What exactly did peasants eat in medieval times, and how did the ordinary people of the Middle Ages gather enough strength to plough frozen fields, haul stones, raise timber, and survive a world that demanded constant labor from dawn until dusk? If you close your eyes for a moment and allow the dim glow of a medieval fire to flicker in your imagination, you might see a low, smoky cottage with a thatched roof, its single-room interior warmed by embers that never fully die, because firewood is precious and work begins early. You might hear the quiet clatter of wooden bowls, the soft murmur of a family preparing for another day, and the earthy, comforting smell of coarse bread, ale, and something simmering slowly in a small pot over charcoal rather than flames, because flames burn too quickly and too dangerously for people who cannot afford waste. In this gentle, lived-in world, peasants didn't think of cuisine or recipes the way we do now. They thought of fuel, of warmth, of small comforts, and of meals simple enough to prepare every day, yet hearty enough to keep the body going through a life defined by physical work, cold weather, and long hours outdoors. And somehow, through all the scarcity and seasonality, through all the crude tools and harsh winters, the meals they created were far richer, tastier, and more nourishing than the grey slop often imagined by Hollywood. The day of a medieval peasant began not with silence but with routine, and the first thing almost every person reached for was bread. Not the soft white loaf familiar to us today, but a darker, denser, more rustic bread made from barley or rye, flours that required less refinement, and were therefore accessible to the poor, with a coarser texture, a slightly nutty aroma, and a colour that medieval people associated with poverty, even though in our world such bread might be sold as premium and artisanal. This bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, and it would be eaten alongside ale, because ale was safer than questionable water sources, mild enough to be consumed even by children, and brewed locally with whatever barley or hops a village could grow, giving every region its own small variation in taste. Breakfast was simple, nothing more than bread and ale for most days, and peasants did not sit for long, since fields didn't wait, animals needed tending, and heat from the hearth was too precious to waste. With the first light falling across the fields and mist rising in pale ribbons over ploughed soil, the people who fed medieval society stepped out into a world that required strength, endurance, and many hours before the next and more substantial meal, the midday feast that mattered most and kept them going until night fell once again. As the sun climbed higher over the open fields and the work of the day became heavier, with hours marked not by clocks but by the steady rhythm of tools striking earth and wood, hunger began to gather slowly in the belly like the rising mist of early morning, and it was then, at the quiet middle of the day, that peasants finally set down their burdens, wiped the sweat from their brows, and returned to their small, smoky cottages for the single, truly substantial meal they would eat before nightfall. A meal that was not glamorous nor delicate, but warm, nourishing, and shaped entirely by necessity. Most often this midday meal revolved around a thick, simmering dish known simply as pottage, a humble mixture cooked slowly in a clay or iron pot, resting not over open flames but over glowing charcoal, because real flames were wasteful, dangerous, and far too precious for people who needed to make every piece of fuel last through cold seasons and long evenings. This pottage was usually made of peas, beans, or other hardy legumes that grew dependably in village gardens, thickened with onions, herbs, or leafy greens, and flavoured with a pinch of salt, or perhaps a single leftover bone from an autumn pig slaughter, the warmth of the pot sending up a comforting aroma that drifted through the cottage like a promise, for every spoonful carried not only taste, but the strength needed to return to the fields and continue the labour of survival. Alongside the pot there was always bread, the same coarse barley or rye loaf that had begun the morning, sliced into heavy pieces sturdy enough to serve as both plate and utensil, because in the medieval world an old habit carried from generation to generation taught families to pour sauces over bread and wipe bowls clean with the crusts, turning every crumb into part of the meal rather than letting any resource go to waste. Where rivers ran clear and generous, fish joined the table as well. Most surprisingly, the salmon, which in the Middle Ages was not a luxury but a common food for the poor, so abundant in northern waters that even the humblest families could eat it frequently, a curious reversal of our modern expectations. And for such fish, a simple sorrel sauce was sometimes prepared, the bright green leaves crushed with salt in a mortar until they released their sharp, fresh scent, then strained through a piece of linen into a thin, vivid liquid whose tartness awakened the taste of the meal in a way that feels almost modern. Inside the dim cottage, as the pottage steamed and the bread softened and the fish flaked gently from its bones, workers with tired hands finally paused, letting warmth and nourishment settle into their bodies, and for a brief hour the world slowed. The crackling charcoal whispered softly, the smoke curled lazily beneath the rafters, and the family savoured a moment of quiet comfort in a life defined by movement, weather, and duty. For medieval peasants, the midday meal was more than food. It was the pause that allowed them to gather their strength, a warm reminder that even in a world of hardship, the simplest ingredients could bring surprising satisfaction and the will to continue. As the warm heaviness of the midday meal settled into their bodies, and the brief pause of rest softened the ache in their shoulders, peasants knew that the strength to continue the day did not come only from bread or pottage or fish, but also from the careful, deliberate way medieval families managed the little meat they possessed, treating every scrap as valuable, every bone as useful, and every part of an animal as something not to be wasted. Meat was not an everyday luxury. It was a seasonal reward, a slow and thoughtful resource, and for most families the single most important animal they raised was the pig. A creature small enough to keep behind a house, hardy enough to thrive on scraps, and generous enough to provide food for weeks if handled with skill and patience. When winter approached and feeding an animal through the cold months became impossible, the pig was slaughtered, and the process was not a moment of indulgence but an act of survival, carried out with the quiet understanding that nothing, not a drop, not a fragment, would be discarded. The fresh meat would be salted, smoked, or hung above the hearth, where the gentle curl of smoke from the cottage fire slowly turned it into bacon, a precious, flavorful treasure that could be sliced thinly throughout the cold season, added to pottage for depth, or fried in small bits to give strength to a morning meal. The organs would be cooked or preserved, the intestines cleaned and used as sausage casings, the blood caught carefully to make black pudding, and even the fat rendered into tallow for cooking or candles. Inside the cottage you might see a simple wooden beam above the fire, a place where strips of bacon hung throughout the winter, cured by heat and smoke in a process so common that medieval families barely considered it remarkable. Though to us the sight feels almost comforting, a reminder of resilience in a world where everything had to be earned. The presence of bacon or salted pork in a peasant's home did not mean abundance. It meant discipline, weeks of preparing, preserving, and rationing, making sure that one animal could stretch across an entire season of hard frost and dim light. Even bones, once stripped of meat, were simmered in water for hours until they surrendered their marrow and flavor, creating a broth that enriched pottages and kept families warm from the inside. And nothing was thrown away, because waste was a luxury a medieval village simply did not have. Life depended on thrift, and thrift depended on making every creature, every harvest, every stored bite of food last as long as possible. And yet, despite the scarcity and the careful portioning, there was a deep and unspoken satisfaction in these meals, for they connected the family to the rhythms of the land, to the pigs they raised, to the smoke in their rafters, to the bread cooling on their tables, and to the long, unbroken line of ancestors who had lived the same way for generations. In this slow, smoky world, food was not taken for granted, It was respected, preserved, transformed, and shared in the quiet glow of a hearth that refused to die. As the light of the day faded and the long shadows of barns, hedges, and half-ploughed furrows stretched across the fields, peasants returned home for the final time, weary from labour yet comforted by the simple knowledge that the hardest work of the day was finished. And although the evening meal was never grand, it carried a sense of closure, a gentle winding down that helped the body settle into the quiet rhythm of medieval nights. Unlike the hearty midday feast, supper was intentionally light, often little more than bread and cheese, perhaps a slice of cold bacon saved from earlier, or a leftover ladle of pottage reheated quickly over the embers, because by this hour daylight was slipping away, and firelight was too dim and valuable to waste on elaborate cooking. The medieval day moved with the sun, so as soon as darkness settled, the cottage dimmed to the glow of a single fire, and families gathered around it not to dine richly but to conserve strength until morning. Children might sip a small cup of warm ale, adults shared a few quiet words about the next day's chores, and the scents of the cottage, earthy bread, wood smoke, and the faint aroma of cured meat merged into the comforting smell of home. In winter, when nights came early, and wines slipped through cracks in the timber walls, the evening meal felt even more essential, not because it was large, but because it reminded the family of the work they had completed, and the warmth they had managed to hold on to. Food in medieval life was never constant. It changed with seasons in ways almost forgotten today. Spring brought fresh greens like sorrel, onions, leeks, and young herbs, ingredients that transformed pottage from a winter necessity into something bright and lively. Summer offered berries, vegetables, and the fullness of gardens growing under generous light. Autumn was the season of gathering, drying, smoking, salting, and storing, an anxious but hopeful time when families prepared for the cold months ahead, knowing that their survival depended on how carefully they preserved their harvest. And winter, long and unyielding, reminded everyone of their limits. No fresh fruit, few greens, and every meal made from what had been tucked away earlier in the year. Even then, despite hardship, medieval peasants were not starving silhouettes from grim legends. They were practical, clever, and deeply connected to the land, and though their meals lacked the richness of noble feasts, they were surprisingly wholesome. Bread, cheese, bacon, pottage, ale, eggs, onions, beans, and seasonal greens. These formed the backbone of daily life, and from these simple ingredients peasants drew the strength to work from dawn to dusk, year after year, generation after generation. The rhythm of eating and working, of planting and storing, of slaughtering and preserving, created a pattern that was both demanding and reassuring, a pattern that wrapped entire communities in shared struggle and shared nourishment. And as the final embers of the evening fire faded into a soft red glow, peasants drifted to sleep, already knowing what tomorrow would ask of them, and trusting that the food they prepared with such care would be enough to meet it. Though the life of a medieval peasant was shaped by routine, frugality, and the steady repetition of chores that never truly ended, there were moments, rare, anticipated, and cherished, when the ordinary rhythm of bread and pottage gave way to something richer, brighter, and more festive. Moments when a village celebrated a wedding, a successful harvest, a saint's feast day, or even a communal slaughtering of animals before winter. And in those fleeting hours, food became not just sustenance but connection, joy, and memory. It was during these gatherings that peasants tasted dishes far beyond their everyday table, dishes that shimmered like little islands of luxury in a sea of simplicity. At such celebrations, the feast usually began with meat, real meat, plentiful and freshly cooked, often roasted in great quantities over open flames, something almost never done in ordinary homes because wood was precious and roasting required both time and abundance. A village might roast a whole pig or lamb, turning it slowly until its skin crackled and glistened, and the scent of cooking meat drifted down the lanes, drawing children and adults alike toward the communal tables. If the harvest had been good, the meal might include fresh bread made from higher quality flour, light in color and rare enough to feel like a nobleman's treat, its soft crumb and delicate crust a delightful contrast to the dense barley loaves of daily life. Alongside the meat, villagers shared fresh cheese, new ale brewed just for the occasion, and great bowls of vegetables and herbs gathered from every garden in the settlement, each family contributing what they could spare: carrots, leeks, cabbage, turnips, parsley, mint, creating platters as colourful as they were filling. Sometimes, if fortune allowed, there might even be honey cakes or spiced pastries, flavoured with expensive ingredients like cinnamon or nutmeg brought by distant traders, and used sparingly, for even a pinch of such spices cost more than most peasants earned in a week. Fish, too, appeared in richer forms during festive seasons, not simply boiled or smoked but baked in pies, layered with herbs and onions, or served with special sauces made from vinegar, mustard, or herbs gathered in spring. Even ale tasted different at feasts, stronger and more carefully brewed, with a deeper colour and richer foam, a sign that the celebration was more than routine. The tables were set not with plates for each person, because such things were uncommon, but with large wooden boards and shared trenchers, and the act of eating together carried a warmth far beyond the flavour of the food, for in the medieval world a feast was not merely about taste, it was about community. Stories were exchanged, songs were sung, laughter rose under low-thatched roofs, and for a brief time the weight of the year lifted from tired shoulders, replaced by the comfort of companionship and abundance. These moments mattered more than we imagine, because they reminded peasants that life was not only labour and repetition, but also joy, rhythm, celebration, and the brief sparkle of richness in a world that offered few luxuries. And even after the feast ended and the tables were cleared and the fire dimmed to glowing coals, the memory of flavours, spiced bread, roasted pork, fresh cheese, sweet honey, lingered like a soft ember in the mind, a small warmth carried into the long cycle of work and simple meals that would follow. If you imagine for a moment the kitchen of a medieval peasant, you may picture a bustling room filled with pots and pans, shelves of herbs, and the familiar glow of a fireplace. Yet the reality was far humbler, quieter, and shaped entirely by necessity, with every object serving multiple purposes and every tool crafted by hand or inherited across generations until it bore the soft polish of decades of use. Most peasants cooked not in a separate kitchen, but in a single-room cottage, where daily life, sleep, work, and meals all unfolded around the central hearth, a square or round depression lined with stones, glowing with charcoal rather than roaring flames, because charcoal burned hotter, cleaner, and longer, allowing food to cook slowly without filling the room with choking smoke. The tools they used were simple but ingenious. A single iron pot suspended from a hook or tripod, heavy enough to last a lifetime. A wooden ladle carved by a grandfather long past. A clay bowl patched and repatched until the lines of repair became part of its identity. And a mortar and pestle used to crush herbs, grains, and leaves into sauces and pastes, the rhythmic sound of grinding, echoing softly through the room like a heartbeat. The hearth was the centre of everything. Warmth, light, cooking, and peasants were masters of shifting pots closer or farther from the heat, controlling temperature with the same intuition we now reserve for stoves and timers. In place of cutting boards and metal knives of varying shapes, peasants made do with a single sturdy blade, sharpened on stones beside the door, and wooden boards that were rarely washed with water, but scraped clean and dried by smoke. For most families, spoons were carved from local wood, trenchers were made of stale bread or thick wooden slabs, and most meals were eaten with the hands, with gestures so practiced and natural that they hardly seemed like etiquette at all. When it came to storing food, the medieval peasant household relied more on air, smoke, and time than on any kind of container. Meat was hung from beams above the fire, cheese was wrapped in cloth and set in cool corners of the house, grain was stored in wooden chests or clay pots sealed with wax, and herbs were tied in bundles near the rafters to dry slowly over weeks. releasing their aroma into the air as they curled and darkened. The cottage itself became a pantry, every beam and hook a tool, every corner a place for keeping something safe through winter. Even water was managed with care, drawn from a well if one existed, from a stream if the land was kind, or collected from rain barrels when the sky allowed it. Contrary to the popular myth, peasants did drink water when it was clean, but because clean water was never guaranteed, ale became both drink and safeguard, brewed lightly, consumed daily, and trusted deeply. And yet, despite all its simplicity, a medieval peasant kitchen was far from primitive. It was efficient, resourceful, and refined by centuries of habit. Every movement, every tool, every technique shaped by survival and passed on like a quiet inheritance. There is a kind of beauty in how little they needed. A pot, a spoon, a knife, a fire, and the knowledge of how to turn the land's gifts into something warm, filling, and comforting at the end of a long day. As night gathered beyond the small windows and the hearth dimmed to a soft red glow, medieval families relied on these humble tools to sustain them, not only with food, but with the assurance that no matter how hard the world might be, the fire would remain warm, the pot would remain useful, and tomorrow's meals would find their way to the table just as surely as today's. Though medieval life had its rhythms of comfort, fresh bread in the morning, warm pottage at midday, the soft glow of a hearth in the evening, there were also seasons when food became thin, harvests failed, and even the hardiest of families felt the slow tightening of worry in their stomachs, because in a world governed by weather and soil rather than machines and trade routes, one cold spring or one summer of storms could transform plenty into hardship almost overnight. These difficult periods, remembered even centuries later, were known simply as the hunger months, the long stretch between winter's end and the first reliable crops of summer, when storage barrels ran low, the last onions sprouted in the dark corners where they were kept, and families had to stretch what little they had with creativity, patience, and a deep trust in the land's eventual return to generosity. During these lean times, meals shrank into smaller, humbler portions, pottage made thinner, bread baked from coarser grain mixed with whatever filler could be found, oats, millet, even ground acorns or chestnuts, so that a single sack of flour could last a few weeks longer. Foraging became essential, and entire families walked the edges of forests and fields searching for edible greens, nettles, wild garlic, sorrel, dandelion leaves, and anything else that could be gently coaxed into a pot, turning simple weeds into something warm enough to keep hope alive. Children learned early how to recognize plants that were safe and those that were not, and grandmothers knew dozens of quiet tricks: how to soften bitter leaves with boiling water, how to thicken thin pottage with crushed grains, how to use herbs to make a meager meal feel rich enough to quiet a child's hunger. In especially hard years, villagers leaned on one another with a kind of shared patience that was born from centuries of facing the same struggles. Neighbors exchanged what they had, one house offering a little salted meat, another sharing dried peas, another giving a jar of honey saved for winter illnesses, and these small acts of generosity created a delicate web that kept famine at bay more often than history remembers. Church alms and manorial stores sometimes helped, though they were limited and often stretched thin, and families who still had pigs or goats, but could not afford to feed them through the hunger months, made the difficult decision to slaughter them early, preserving whatever they could in salt and smoke, and relying on the faint hope that next year would be kinder. And yet, even in these seasons of scarcity, peasants maintained a quiet resilience. They understood that the land moved in cycles, that hardship and abundance came in turns, that spring's sharp hunger was the shadow cast by summer's promise. By early June, the first vegetables, peas, leeks, young onions, began to push through the soil, their green shoots breaking the monotony of winter and offering a kind of relief more emotional than culinary. A few weeks later, berries ripened, herbs flourished, and bread could once again be made from fresh grain rather than scraps of the previous year's stores. These early foods tasted different, not because of their ingredients, but because of their meaning. The first peas, after months of scarcity, carried a sweetness that soothed the soul, a reminder that life remained possible even after the hardest times. And so peasants ate these meals slowly, gratefully, savoring each bite with the calm certainty that another year had been survived, and another cycle of work, harvest and rest had begun again. In this way, the medieval world taught its people a quiet lesson, one that lingered in their minds long after hunger faded, that food was not simply something served on a table, but something earned, treasured, shared, and trusted, a fragile blessing binding together whole communities through seasons of both joy and hardship. Although medieval peasant diets are often imagined as bland and colourless, the reality was far more nuanced. For even the simplest cottage kept a small patch of herbs near the door or along the edge of a field, and from these humble plants, peasants coaxed flavours that turned their meals into something memorable, not luxurious, but lively in a quiet, earthy way. These herbs were not used sparingly out of refinement, but generously out of practicality, because herbs grew freely in even the poorest soil, and a handful of chopped leaves could transform a pot of peas or onions from mere fuel into something comforting enough to lift the spirit after hours of hard labour. Common herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, sorrel, mint and chives, were part of nearly every household, while wild herbs gathered from meadows and woods brought seasonal variety to the table. Sorrel in particular was prized for its sharp, almost lemon-like tang, and when crushed with salt and strained through cloth, it created a vivid green sauce that complemented fish or grains with a brightness medieval palates appreciated even without modern vocabulary to describe it. Mint found its way into pottage during summer, thyme added depth to winter stews, and parsley, easy to grow and quick to regenerate, was used in such abundance that some medieval manuscripts refer to it as a plant without end. Garlic and onions were the backbone of flavour, added to nearly every cooked dish except on fasting days, their strong scent drifting through cottages at nearly all hours. These were vegetables of the poor, not because they lacked value, but because they were hardy, stored well, and could survive mediocre soils. The aroma of a medieval village was not one of decay or smoke alone. It was the smell of onions softening over a gentle heat, of herbs drying near the rafters, of sorrel being ground into paste, of beans simmering patiently in pots that rarely left the hearth. Salt, precious and often imported, was used carefully, but when available it allowed peasants to cure meat, preserve fish, and season dishes in ways that felt almost luxurious. Vinegar, milder than modern varieties, was common and made from ale that had spoiled or from fruit left to ferment, lending acidity to sauces and pickles. Mustard, crushed by hand, was sometimes mixed with herbs to create a sharp condiment for meat or fish. And though sugar was almost entirely unknown to peasants, honey served as both sweetener and medicine, drizzled sparingly into porridges or used to glaze small cakes during festivals. The flavours of medieval peasant food were not bland, they were honest. They reflected the soil, the seasons and the hands that tended the gardens. A pot of beans seasoned with thyme tasted of summer hedgerows, fish with sorrel sauce tasted of spring rain, winter pottage with onions and sage tasted of heat preserved through the coldest months. These flavours were simple yet deeply satisfying, and they tied peasants to their land with a kind of intimacy modern diets seldom replicate. And as families gathered around their hearths, bowls warm in their hands and herbs perfuming the air, the act of seasoning food became a small, steady reminder that even in lives shaped by toil and scarcity, beauty could still be coaxed from the earth with nothing more than patience, knowledge, and a few green leaves growing beneath a cottage window. When imagining medieval life, many people repeat the familiar myth that peasants avoided water entirely and drank only ale. Yet the truth is far more balanced and rooted in simple practicality. For medieval people drank whatever was safest and most available, And while water from a clean well or spring was welcomed and consumed without hesitation, ale remained the dependable companion of every meal, because it was predictable, nourishing, and far less likely to carry disease. In a world without modern sanitation, streams could be clean after rainfall and dangerous the following week, while a jug of freshly brewed ale, mild and lightly fermented, carried no such uncertainty and offered a small but steady source of calories that helped sustain those who worked long hours in the fields. This ale was not the heavy, bitter beer familiar today, nor the strong drink served in taverns centuries later, but a gentle, almost bread-like beverage brewed in small batches inside cottages, sometimes by the women of the household, sometimes communally, and it was consumed by adults and children alike. It was low in alcohol, enough to keep harmful waterborne bacteria at bay, but mild enough to drink throughout the day without dulling the senses needed for labor. Each region, and indeed each household, had its own subtle variation, shaped by local barley, the freshness of hops, and the skill of the brewer, so that ale carried not just nourishment but identity, the taste of a village preserved in every jug. Alongside ale, cider was common in regions with apple orchards, particularly in late summer and autumn when fruit was abundant and fermentation quickened. Cider varied greatly in sweetness depending on the apple harvest, but like ale, it was typically mild, refreshing, and consumed daily without ceremony. In some places, perry made from pears filled the same role, a soft, fruity drink that cut through the heaviness of bread and beans with surprising brightness. On special occasions or in particularly fortunate households, mead appeared, honey mixed with water, and left to ferment into a golden floral drink, whose rarity made it almost sacred. Mead was expensive because honey itself was precious, harvested from wild hives or carefully tended skeps woven from straw, and even a small cup felt like tasting sunlight preserved in liquid form. While nobles drank it often, peasants might only taste mead once or twice a year, usually at festivals or weddings, where each sip carried a sweetness that lingered as both flavor and memory. Yet, water was never absent from medieval life. Wells were dug deep, springs were mapped and protected, and rivers were approached with careful judgment. Water was boiled for cooking, used to mix dough, fill pots, and prepare herbs, and when it was clean, as it often was in rural areas far from crowded towns, peasants drank it freely. The idea that every medieval person avoided water entirely is as modern a myth as it is persistent. What they avoided was risk, and ale simply reduced uncertainty. So at every meal, morning bread, midday pottage, evening cheese, there was always a cup within reach, be it ale, cider, or clean water. And the act of drinking in this world had less to do with pleasure than with survival, a quiet, habitual reassurance that the body's needs were met in a place where the margins between health and illness were thin. In this way, each sip, no matter how humble, became part of the deep rhythm of medieval sustenance, a rhythm that carried families through hard winters, long summers, and the cycles of work and rest that defined their lives. If you follow a peasant through a full day, quietly, gently, without disturbing the rhythm of their work, you begin to understand that medieval food was not a series of meals, but a steady current that carried them through the hours, each bite shaped by the land, the season, and the unspoken understanding that life depended on making simple things last. A peasant's day began not with indulgence, but with fuel. Coarse bread torn by hand, dipped in a little ale, chewed slowly while the sky was still pale and cold, the taste of barley and rye grounding them before stepping into fields still heavy with dew. By mid-morning, the hunger returned like a familiar companion, but there was no time to stop, and so they worked through it, relying on the memory of breakfast and the promise of the midday meal waiting at home. When that moment finally came, it unfolded not with ceremony but with a kind of relief, as the family gathered around the hearth and the pot was lifted from the charcoal. The scent of beans, peas, onions, and herbs rose into the air in a warm, comforting cloud, and the first spoonful of pottage felt like lifting a weight from the inside out. Thick, hearty, filling, exactly what a body needed after hours of bending, lifting, and walking. Children dipped bread into the stew. Mothers scraped the last bits from the bottom of the pot. Fathers cut slivers of salted bacon or fish to share among everyone, and for a short time the cottage hummed with soft voices, clinking bowls, and the small joy of being warm and fed. After this, the day's work resumed, fields calling again with an inevitability that peasants accepted without complaint, for the land provided what they needed, but only if they gave themselves fully to it. As evening settled and darkness crept across the village like a slow tide, supper came quietly, lighter, simpler, a way to settle the stomach but not tax the fire. Bread, cheese, perhaps a few leftover vegetables or a bit of cold pottage, warmed just enough to be comforting. The hearth dimmed, the children's eyes grew heavy, and the taste of the day's final meal lingered softly on their tongues as they drifted toward sleep. There was no abundance, but there was enough, and in a world where survival relied on constant work, enough carried a beauty of its own. Through these meals, modest, repeated, shaped by nature rather than preference, you begin to see how peasants lived, not day to day but season to season, storing food when the land was generous, stretching every ingredient when it was stern, and eating in harmony with cycles older than any written recipe. Their food did not define luxury or wealth. It defined endurance, tradition, and the quiet strength required to build a world from soil, grain, and patience. In every piece of bread, in every bowl of pottage, in every sip of ale or well water, there was the pulse of medieval life, steady, resilient, and deeply human. If you look closely at the life of a medieval peasant, you begin to notice that their food was not merely a matter of daily meals, but the unfolding of an entire year, a long circular journey where each month carried its own flavors, worries, tasks, and small victories. Unlike today, where seasons influence mood more than survival, in the Middle Ages the turning of the year decided what people ate, how much they worked, how long they rested, and how carefully they planned, for a single mistake in timing could echo through winter like an accusation. In January, the cold lay heavy over the land, fields became silent under frost, and peasants turned to whatever stores they had managed to protect from moisture, rodents, or spoilage. Meals were the simplest of the year: thick winter pottage made from dried peas, onions that had softened in storage, and the last scraps of salted pork shaved thinly so the flavor would stretch. Bread baked in January was often dense, made from grain that had dried for months, and sometimes mixed with oats or millet to make it last. Everything smelled of smoke, the bacon drying above the hearth, the herbs hanging from rafters, the clothes, the walls, because smoke was warmth, and warmth was life. February brought no relief, and this was the month medieval people feared most, because supplies grew thin just as winter seemed endless. This was when the cleverness of a household truly showed: beans preserved carefully in linen sacks, garlic bulbs braided so they wouldn't rot, apples wrapped in straw to keep them crisp. Nothing fresh grew outside, so hope lived in jars, barrels, and salted meat. The pottage grew thinner, the slices of bread smaller, and families moved quietly through their days, saving energy and waiting for the slightest sign of spring. Then came March, and although the air was still sharp and soil still cold, something changed. Green shoots appeared, tiny trembling hints of life, and peasants rushed to gather the first wild leaves: nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, and young dandelion. These herbs were the first fresh food since autumn, and they brought a brightness to meals that felt almost miraculous after months of hardness. A simple pottage of nettles and onions became a feast simply because it tasted alive. April allowed more greens to emerge, and by then villages buzzed softly with the work of preparing fields, sowing barley, oats, and wheat, tending sheep and goats, and repairing tools worn out by winter. The diet became varied with spring onions, chives, young carrots, and fresh herbs, small treasures that lifted the spirit. Eggs became plentiful again too, since hens began laying after their winter pause. and a soft-boiled egg was considered a kindness reserved for children, the sick, or someone returning from long work. May brought milk in abundance as animals grazed on fresh pasture, and peasants made soft cheese, butter, and buttermilk. This was a month of gentle meals, cheese with bread, milk soups with herbs, and pottage enriched with new vegetables. The world tasted tender again. By June and July, the fields demanded every hour of daylight, and meals were quick, bread dipped in ale, cold pottage thickened from the night before, and occasionally fish caught from rivers running low in summer heat. Fresh beans, peas, and early roots found their way into meals, and gardens swelled with herbs, making everything fragrant and almost luxurious. Then August arrived, the month of first harvests, and suddenly the year bent toward abundance. Barley was cut, oats collected, fruit ripened on trees, and bread baked from new grain-filled cottages with a smell so warm and comforting that medieval writers described it as the perfume of relief. This was the moment peasants felt safest. Granaries filling, the promise of winter security forming slowly in sacks and bins, the fear of scarcity easing. September was even richer, the true harvest, wheat brought in, grapes gathered for simple wine in some regions, apples pressed into cider, vegetables pulled from the soil and stored in cool pits. This was the month of feasting and celebration, when the anxiety of the year released itself into gatherings, music, and shared meals. October brought slaughtering season, when families butchered pigs or goats they could not feed through winter. The air smelled of smoke, brine, and meat drying slowly over fires. Bacon was salted, sausages stuffed, fat rendered, and nothing was wasted. Pottage became hearty again, filled with warmth and strength. In November, roots dominated the diet. Turnips, carrots, leeks, parsnips, tucked away in underground cellars. Bread returned to its darker, humbler flavors as the new wheat was rationed carefully. The days were shorter, meals heavier, and nights long. And then came December, a month of cold, darkness, but also celebration. Christmas brought rare additions, spiced ale, if the village could afford it, honey cakes, roasted meat, shared by the whole community, herbs saved specially for feasts. Even the poorest family tried to make something festive, even if only bread baked into a special shape or pottage flavored with a precious pinch of dried herbs. Through this entire cycle, medieval food was not random. It was the echo of seasons, the memory of harvests, the logic of survival, and the quiet rhythm of nature dictating each ingredient. Their meals told the story of the year, one pot, one loaf, one handful of herbs at a time. To understand medieval food fully, you must step gently into the quiet but powerful presence of the church, for religion shaped not only how people prayed, worked, and rested, but also how and when they ate. For peasants, food was never simply food. It was woven into a calendar of sacred obligations, fasting days, feast days, and rules that governed what could and could not be consumed. These spiritual boundaries created a rhythm that touched every kitchen, every pot, every piece of bread, and every home, transforming the act of eating into an expression of devotion as much as survival. Throughout the medieval year, the church prescribed numerous fasting days, during which meat was forbidden, and sometimes dairy and eggs as well. Lent was the longest and strictest of these periods, stretching for 40 days before Easter, and for a medieval peasant, Lent transformed the cottage menu completely. Instead of bacon and animal fat, households used oil if they had access to it, or more commonly watery broths flavored with herbs, onions, and whatever fish could be caught. Fish, in fact, became the centerpiece of fasting meals. Smoked herring, dried cod, river fish, baked or boiled, and seafood such as mussels or oysters in coastal regions, all prepared simply and eaten with a sense of humble obedience. The taste of Lent was clean, sparse, and earthy, barley bread rather than wheat, pottages made thin and without meat, vegetables boiled until soft and seasoned only with herbs and salt. Children felt the change immediately. waking to breakfasts less filling and going to bed with stomachs less satisfied. Yet the fast was understood as necessary, a spiritual training as regular as the turning of the seasons. But Lent was only one part of a larger structure. Every Friday of the year was a fasting day, free from meat. Many Wednesdays were as well, depending on region and century. Entire weeks around major feast days were meatless, and the vigil before any holy day often required abstinence. For a medieval peasant, this meant that nearly a third of the year was lived without meat, shaping their diet profoundly. Because of this, fish was dried, salted, smoked, and stored in quantities unimaginable to us today. Even inland villages far from the sea had access to preserved fish shipped by river or cart from port towns, so long as they could afford it. During fasting seasons, the cottage hearth simmered with different aromas. Instead of bacon fat crackling in the pan, the smell was of vegetables softening slowly, of leeks simmering in water, of peas breaking down into a simple, comforting mush. Bread remained the constant companion, sometimes dipped into fish broth, sometimes smeared with a paste of herbs and garlic, sometimes eaten plain. Ale was always present, for the church never forbade its consumption, and people drank it with gratitude on days when food was modest. Yet medieval fasting was not only about deprivation, it was also about anticipation. After weeks of restraint, the arrival of Easter or Christmas felt like sunlight breaking through a long winter. The first bite of meat after Lent was described by medieval writers as a kind of joy that filled the entire household, and families prepared carefully for this moment, saving a small piece of pork or beef, seasoning it with herbs dried months before, and roasting it slowly over a controlled fire that made even the coldest cottage feel warm. Feast days were the contrast to fasting days, and they punctuated the medieval year with moments of abundance. Meat roasted on spits, cheese brought out from storage, bread made of fine wheat flour instead of the darker barley. The difference between fasting and feasting gave medieval life a pattern of ebb and flow, scarcity then plenty, abstinence then indulgence, and this pattern shaped not only their stomachs but their spirits. Food tasted better when it followed fasting. Moments of plenty shone brighter against the memory of restraint, and through this delicate balance, peasants navigated their faith with the same steady patience they brought to their fields. They ate simply because life demanded it. They fasted because the church required it. They feasted because the year needed it. And woven between hunger and abundance, prayer and work, they built a world where eating was both a necessity of the body and a ritual of the soul. If you look closely at a medieval cottage, at the quiet movements around the hearth, at the way meals were prepared and stored and kept alive through the coldest months, you begin to see that the true guardians of food were not the lords who owned the land nor the men who ploughed the fields, but the women who shaped every grain, every herb, every piece of meat into something edible. Their work was constant, patient, and largely invisible to written history. Yet without them, a medieval household could not function for a single day, because food was not merely cooked, it was managed, transformed, preserved, and protected, with a skill passed down from mother to daughter like a living thread running through generations. In the early hours before sunrise, while the sky was still iron grey and cold enough to sting the skin, women rose to light the hearth, coaxing embers back to life with careful breaths and handfuls of tinder. The hearth did not roar, it glowed, a soft enduring pulse of heat that would warm the room, bake the bread, simmer the pottage, dry the herbs, and smoke the meat all at once. Before anyone else stirred, they prepared the morning bread, sometimes kneading dough made from barley or rye flour, sometimes slicing yesterday's loaf, sometimes simply softening hard crusts in warm ale for the children. This small gesture marked the beginning of the day, a ritual repeated across thousands of cottages. Throughout the morning, women moved between tasks that rarely stopped grinding grain with a hand mill, a slow and rhythmic labor that filled the cottage with the muted sound of stone against stone, gathering herbs from the small garden outside, tending to the fire, preparing vegetables for the midday meal, mending cloth sacks in which beans or peas were stored. The hand mill alone required strength and endurance. Turning it for an hour could feel like the work of an entire day, but it was essential because flour could not be bought easily, and grain sent to the Lord's mill came with fees many families could not afford. Women also oversaw the garden, the quiet, fertile patch beside the cottage where leeks, onions, cabbage, parsley, sage, sorrel, beans, and garlic grew in small, ordered rows. The garden was not just a source of food, it was a shield against hunger, a place where a single handful of herbs could turn thin pottage into something fragrant, where a cluster of onions could keep a family fed through winter, and where each plant reflected the work of months. Medieval women understood the seasons intimately, when to pick herbs for drying, when to plant onions, when to harvest beans before the pods grew tough, when to bring vegetables indoors to protect them from frost. Inside the cottage, women preserved food with extraordinary ingenuity. They dried herbs by hanging them from rafters. They rubbed salt into strips of pork and carefully smoked them over slow fires. They baked bread that could last weeks. They stored apples in straw-lined baskets. They pickled vegetables in vinegar to last the winter. If a family owned a pig, it was women who cleaned the intestines and prepared sausage casings, rendered fat, salted blood for puddings, and organized the precious cuts of meat so that nothing spoiled. The entire winter diet depended on this delicate balance of timing and knowledge. Even in times of scarcity, it was women who stretched meals so that every member of the household got something, watering down pottage without losing its warmth, grinding dried peas into flour to fortify bread, adding wild greens to bulk up stew, boiling bones twice or even 3 times to extract the last traces of nourishment. To the modern eye, this might seem like hardship, but to medieval women it was simply life, learned from an early age, carried out with a quiet competence that kept entire villages alive. Children learned from watching. A girl might sit beside her mother peeling onions, her small hands clumsy but determined, while the mother recited old wisdom, how to know when bread dough has risen enough, by touching it lightly with a fingertip, how to judge charcoal temperature by holding a palm above it, how to tell whether dried peas are still good by the smell alone. Women were the memory of the household, the keepers of recipes few could read but all understood. As evening approached and the light outside dimmed to gold, then copper, then ash-grey, women returned to the hearth to warm leftovers from midday, or slice cheese, or prepare a simple meal of bread and ale. They knew exactly how much to serve, how much to save, how much to hide away in case tomorrow proved hard. Their work ended only when the fire dimmed and children fell asleep, the smell of bread and smoke lingering in the air. In the grand stories of medieval Europe, knights, kings, battles, castles, women rarely appear, but in the quiet, unlit world of cottages and fields, they were the foundation, the hearth-keepers, the ones who transformed handfuls of grain into meals, who carried the knowledge of generations in their hands, and whose daily efforts fed an entire civilization one simple bowl at a time. If you follow the soft footsteps of a medieval child through the narrow lanes of a village, past the chickens scratching in the dirt and the smoke drifting lazily from cottage roofs, you begin to understand that the food of childhood in the Middle Ages was not a separate category of small delights, but simply a gentler portion of whatever the adults ate, shaped not by indulgence but by necessity, by season, and by the quiet intuition of mothers who knew exactly how much a young stomach could handle. In a world without sugar, as we know it, without sweet treats on shelves, without packaged snacks, medieval children grew up on flavors earthy, mild, and honest, flavors that tied them instinctively to the soil from which the food came. A child's day often began early, sometimes before sunrise, with a piece of coarse barley bread softened in warm ale or dipped in a thin pottage left from the night before. This was breakfast, not a treat, not a moment of excitement, but simply the first fuel of the day, eaten quickly before small chores began. Even very young children were expected to help, gathering firewood, carrying small buckets of water, shooing chickens away from the garden, or holding a basket while their mother harvested herbs. Food was part of these lessons. As they worked, they learned where each ingredient came from, how it grew, and why it mattered. By midday, when adults returned briefly from the fields to eat pottage and bread, children gathered eagerly at the table, their bowls smaller but filled with the same steaming mixture of peas, beans, onions, and herbs. A child's portion lacked the salted pork or bacon that adults sometimes received, not out of cruelty but because the adults were the ones who needed strength for ploughing, reaping, and carrying heavy loads. Children learned early that life was a ladder of responsibility. More strength meant more food, and more food meant more work. Still, the meal was warm, filling, and comforting, and in winter children sat as close as they could to the hearth, holding wooden bowls between cold hands and eating slowly as steam curled into the dim air. On special days after a harvest at a wedding, during a village feast, children tasted things that felt almost magical. A slice of fresh cheese still warm from the churn, a piece of roasted pork crackling on the edge, a honey cake made only once or twice a year, a handful of berries baked into a simple tart. The memory of such flavors stayed with them for months, even years, because in a life where sweetness was rare, it glowed like a small treasure in the mind. For infants and toddlers, food followed its own path. Babies were breastfed as long as possible, often up to 2 years or more, because this gave them the best chance of survival. Once weaned, they ate soft foods, mashed peas, pottage thinned with water, bits of bread chewed first by the mother, so they would soften, and on good days, warm milk from a goat or cow. Medieval mothers watched carefully for signs of illness, loose stools, fevers, rashes, knowing that the wrong food at the wrong time could threaten a child's life in ways modern people often forget. As children grew older, their food grew heartier, mirroring the tasks they now had to perform, carrying water, weeding gardens, helping grind grain on the hand mill, gathering nettles and sorrel for dinner, or walking behind their parents during planting season. A 6-year-old might carry a basket of vegetables, a 10-year-old might tend sheep or goats, an older child might walk miles to gather firewood, and with these duties came the first tastes of the adult diet: salted fish on fasting days, thicker pottage with herbs, small slices of cheese saved especially for hard-working children. Even drinks followed the pattern of necessity. Children drank ale, mild, low in alcohol, safer than water in many cases, and sometimes milk, though milk was often reserved for making butter or cheese rather than drinking. Water was consumed when clean, especially in rural areas with fresh streams, and mothers often showed their children where the safest sources flowed. Treats were rare, but they existed. Apples in autumn, a spoonful of honey when a child was sick, roasted chestnuts, handfuls of berries, warm crusts of new bread on harvest day. These small gifts created a sense of wonder far greater than any modern dessert, because the sweetness came not from abundance but from gratitude. By the time medieval children reached adolescence, their bodies were shaped by years of simple, honest food: bread and ale in the morning, pottage in the afternoon, cheese or leftovers at night, and by the steady rhythm of work that required them to eat for strength rather than pleasure. Food was never entertainment. It was survival, routine, and a quiet reassurance that their family had managed another day. In this world, childhood tasted like bread, onions, herbs, and the faint sweetness of summer fruit, a small palette of flavors that reflected the land, the seasons, and the patient care of the women who fed them. In the quiet corners of a medieval cottage, where the hearth glowed softly and the air smelled of wood smoke, herbs and wool, caring for the sick, was a task of tenderness and instinct, carried out not by physicians or scholars, but by mothers, grandmothers, midwives, and village women who knew the language of the body, not from books but from long observation. Their understanding of food was different from ours, gentle, practical, shaped by necessity, and when illness visited a household, everything changed: the cooking, the ingredients, the atmosphere around the fire. For the sick, food became medicine, and meals that were normally hearty and thick were transformed into soft, mild, easy-to-digest broths. A pot for the ill rarely contained meat, unless the family was wealthy enough to spare it. Instead, it held slowly simmered onions, leeks, garlic, herbs, and occasionally the precious marrow from a cracked bone. The steam rising from such a pot carried both nourishment and comfort, filling the cottage with a warm herbal scent that signaled care. Broth for the sick was thin, warm, and soothing, sipped slowly from wooden cups by children feverish with winter chills or adults weakened by long days of work under harsh weather. Garlic and onions were considered almost miraculous. Medieval people believed strongly in their healing power. Garlic to warm the body and open the lungs, onions to cleanse the stomach and strengthen the heart. These vegetables appeared in nearly every remedy. A woman might mash warm onions into a soft paste and apply them as a poultice to a child's chest, or crush garlic into warm ale for an adult shivering with fever. The taste might have been sharp, but their effects were trusted, passed down through generations of trial and observation. Herbs were another cornerstone of medieval healing, and every cottage kept a small supply of dried leaves, roots, and flowers harvested throughout the year. Sage was used for sore throats, mint for calming the stomach, thyme for chest congestion, chamomile for restless sleep, and nettle for strengthening a weakened body. These herbs were steeped into warm tisanes, infusions that medieval people drank like mild tea, or added in small amounts to broths. The act of preparing such drinks was slow and calming, filling the cottage with gentle aromas that signaled the presence of care, even if the illness was severe. Honey, precious and sweet, was used both as nourishment and as medicine. A spoonful of honey stirred into warm water soothed coughs, coated sore throats, and brought comfort to children crying in the night. For the poorest families, honey was rare, but when it existed, it was given generously to the sick, becoming a symbol of tenderness in a world often marked by harshness. Elders, whose bodies grew thin from years of labor, were given foods that required little chewing: mashed peas softened with broth, warm milk when available, bread soaked in ale, or pottage thinned just enough to slide gently down the throat. Babies, too weak to nurse during illness, were fed tiny portions of warm pottage passed through cloth, their mothers praying quietly over each sip. When sickness grew serious, the entire household shifted its routine. Chores were redistributed, children were quieted, the hearth became the center of attention. A woman might sit beside the fire late into the night stirring a pot so it didn't cool, rising again and again to check on the sick. The glow of the embers reflected on her face, weary yet determined, for in a world without doctors, without pharmacies, and without the certainty of tomorrow, a warm broth, an herbal infusion, or a spoon of honey might be the only tools she had. Sometimes illness passed like a fleeting shadow, leaving behind relief and gratitude. Other times it lingered, testing the family's strength. Medieval people understood that food could not cure everything, but it could comfort, sustain, and give the body its best chance to endure. And so they tended the sick with patience, intuition, and the quiet hope that warmth, herbs, and love might draw them back from the edge. In this way, caring for the ill through food became one of the most intimate acts of medieval life, a small tenderness in a world shaped by labor and struggle, a reminder that even in hardship, compassion simmered gently in every pot. If you step into a medieval village at the right moment at harvest time on a feast day, or during the bustling preparation for winter, you will see something remarkable, something that reveals more about medieval life than any manuscript or castle ruin. People eating together, sharing food not because they had plenty, but because their survival depended on one another. Meals in a medieval community were rarely solitary affairs. They were woven into the fabric of village life, forming a rhythm of togetherness that softened the harshness of the world and made the work of the land bearable. A community meal often began with the sound of voices rather than the smell of cooking. Men returning from the fields, women hauling baskets of vegetables, children gathering firewood, all converged on the central space of the village, a courtyard near the church, an open barn, a green beside the well. Each family brought something small, A loaf of bread, a bowl of beans, a jar of ale, a handful of herbs, a piece of smoked pork if they were fortunate. No one was expected to bring much. The heart of the meal came from combining small offerings into something abundant enough to feed everyone. The biggest events were tied to the agricultural calendar. At harvest, when grain stood golden in the fields and the air carried the scent of ripe fruit, the village came alive with shared work. Men cut wheat with sickles, women tied sheaves, children chased birds from the edges of the fields. At midday, when the sun burned hot and arms ached with labor, a meal was brought directly to the harvest site. Bread, cheese, pottage, ale, and sometimes roasted meat were passed around in baskets and bowls, eaten with dusty hands and laughter. The food might be simple, but the joy was immense, for harvest meant safety, the promise of full granaries and enough bread to last through winter. During threshing, when grain was beaten free from its husk, meals became especially communal. Dust hung in the air, the smell of straw clung to hair and clothes, and the pounding of flails echoed through the fields. Women arrived with large pots of pottage, thickened with beans and herbs, carried on wooden yokes balanced across their shoulders. The pot was set down on a blanket or stone slab, bowls were filled one by one, and every person ate the same food, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. It was during these meals that stories were told, songs were sung, and the bonds of the village deepened. Feast days magnified this spirit. When a wedding took place, or a saint's day was celebrated, or a new barn was raised, the community gathered for a meal larger than any they could make alone. A pig might be slaughtered for the occasion, its meat divided among the participants. Women brought pies stuffed with herbs and onions, cheese wrapped in cloth, baskets of fresh bread and jugs of ale. Children carried armfuls of firewood, and the men roasted meat over large pits dug in the earth. The air was alive with the crackle of fire, the hum of conversation, and the scent of roasting pork. These meals went on for hours, continuing even as dusk gave way to darkness and lanterns flickered in the cool air. But community meals were not only about celebration, they were also a quiet form of mutual aid. If a family lost their harvest to storms or illness, the village shared its food. If someone fell sick, neighbors brought broth, bread, and herbs to their door. If a widow struggled to feed her children, someone would leave a loaf on her windowsill or hang a small piece of salted meat from her rafters. These acts were rarely spoken of. They were a natural part of life, understood as the duty that held the village together. Even the church played a role. On certain days after Mass, food was distributed to the poor, loaves of bread baked specifically for almsgiving, or leftover offerings from wealthier households. Priests and monks often organized small communal meals, especially during feast days or in times of hardship, reinforcing the idea that food was not just nourishment but also charity, fellowship, and spiritual connection. In the cool evenings of late summer, when work slowed and meals were shared under open skies, the sense of community was strongest. People sat on wooden benches or directly on the ground, their bowls held in their hands, their conversations weaving through the twilight. Children played nearby, their laughter mixing with the clink of wooden cups, while elders spoke softly of past harvests and future hopes. The food, though simple, tasted rich in these moments, not because of spices or complicated recipes, but because it was eaten together. Through these shared meals, medieval peasants created a social world far more vibrant than their material one. They found comfort in one another's presence, stability in shared labor, and joy in the small feasts that marked the seasons. In a life marked by uncertainty, community was the real nourishment, the ingredient that made survival possible, and gave meaning to every bowl of pottage and every crust of bread passed from hand to hand. Though many imagine the medieval world as slow and unmoving, in truth the roads were far from empty. Pilgrims walked across kingdoms to visit sacred shrines, messengers carried news between lords, merchants followed trade routes across forests and mountains, soldiers marched in columns, and even ordinary peasants travelled to nearby towns for markets, fairs, or seasonal labour. And wherever people went, food followed, or rather the need for food shaped every step of the journey. To travel in the Middle Ages was to carry your sustenance on your back, in your pockets, or in the deep folds of a leather satchel worn shiny from years of use. At the heart of every traveller's diet was journey bread, hard, dry, durable loaves baked specifically for travel. This bread was not meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to endure, often twice baked, dense enough to feel like stone, darker than everyday loaves, and nearly impossible to chew unless softened in ale or water. This bread could last for weeks without spoiling. Pilgrims carried it wrapped in cloth, tied securely with string, mindful that losing a loaf could mean going hungry for days. Though tough, it was reliable, and reliability was worth far more than taste when the road ahead stretched endlessly. Alongside journey bread, many travellers brought cheese, hard and well-aged to resist mould. Cheese travelled better than meat, offered valuable fat and protein, and could be sliced thinly to stretch across many days. It was often packed in waxed cloth or animal hide to keep it firm. For poorer travellers, cheese might be replaced with a small bag of dried peas or beans, which could be boiled in a traveller's pot if the opportunity arose. Salted or smoked fish was another staple, especially for pilgrims walking long distances to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Canterbury. Dried fish was lightweight, nearly indestructible, and rich in calories. Its saltiness, though overwhelming, served a purpose. It encouraged travellers to drink more, preventing dehydration under the punishing sun or long marches through forests. In addition to these, many pilgrims carried small bags of dried fruit, apples sliced thin and left to dry in ovens, currants or raisins purchased at markets when available, or perhaps dried plums from orchards near home. These fruits were treasured for the small burst of sweetness they brought to an otherwise monotonous diet. But the most important food of all was pottage on the road. When travellers reached a village, monastery, or roadside shelter, they often sought a pot simmering on an open fire. Every settlement, no matter how poor, kept a large pot boiling during daylight hours, especially on feast days or market days. Travellers would pay a coin or offer work in exchange for a ladle of hot pottage, a thick broth of peas, beans, onions, herbs, and sometimes scraps of meat if the host was generous. Even those with nothing to spare might receive a bowl, for feeding a traveller was considered an act of Christian charity, and no one wanted to deny grace to a pilgrim walking in God's name. Monasteries in particular were havens for travellers. Monks offered bread, pottage, and ale, often free of charge, and allowed weary pilgrims to sleep in communal halls. The food was simple but nourishing, usually including bread baked in the monastery ovens and herbs grown in cloister gardens. For many travellers, monastery meals were the only truly filling meals of the journey. Roadside taverns and inns offered more varied fare, though at a price many peasants could not afford. A wealthy merchant might dine on roasted chicken, spiced stews, fried fish, or even sweet pastries made with honey, but the common traveller usually purchased only ale and a bowl of the same pottage eaten everywhere, knowing that a single night at an inn could cost more than a week's wages. For those travelling through forests or mountains, nature itself offered food: berries in summer, nuts in autumn, edible herbs, wild garlic, mushrooms, if one knew which were safe, and occasionally small game like rabbits or birds. Many travellers carried a simple iron pot, a flint for fire, and a wooden spoon, enabling them to cook wherever they stopped for the night. A small fire by the roadside, a bubbling pot of herbs and grains, and a crust of bread softened in warm water formed the heart of countless camps across medieval Europe. Eating on the road meant accepting uncertainty. Some days brought abundance, a monastery feast, a merchant's generosity, a village fair with cheese and fruit, while others brought hunger, rain-soaked bread, or nothing at all. Travellers learned to endure with quiet patience, grateful for every warm bowl of stew, every shared loaf, every cup of ale poured by a sympathetic hand. And as they walked mile after mile, season after season, The taste of the medieval road became a part of them. Simple, persistent, sustaining. The journey's meals were rarely remarkable, but they stitched together the long, wandering paths of a world always in motion, where every traveller hoped that the next village, the next fire, the next pot of pottage would be waiting at the end of the day. Although we often imagine the medieval world as a single unified landscape of thatched cottages and dirt roads, the reality was far more divided. For a medieval city and a medieval village lived almost as though in different centuries, their diets shaped by completely different rhythms, resources, dangers and opportunities. A peasant living deep in the countryside ate food grown with their own hands, cooked on hearths fed with wood gathered from forests, and flavoured with herbs picked from gardens beside the cottage door. A city dweller, by contrast, depended entirely on others for food: farmers, bakers, butchers, fishmongers, brewers, and their meals tasted of trade, market days, and the ever-pulsing life of crowded streets. In cities, the day began before sunrise with the sound of markets awakening, the creak of carts laden with produce, the calls of merchants setting up stalls, the clatter of barrels being rolled toward taverns. Bread, freshly baked in communal ovens or purchased from bakeries, was the backbone of the urban diet. Unlike the coarse barley loaves of the countryside, city bread was often made from wheat flour, lighter in colour and texture, because cities had easier access to imported grain and wealthier customers willing to pay a higher price. For the poor, however, bread remained dark and dense, cheaper loaves mixed with rye, oats or bran, the kind that filled the stomach more than it delighted the palate. City dwellers drank ale as much as villagers did, but there was far more variety in urban brewing. Some ales were light and mild, meant for breakfast or daily labour. Others were stronger, brewed for taverns, celebrations or long evenings spent in the company of travellers and merchants. Breweries lined riverfronts, filling the air with the scent of fermenting barley and hops, and taverns served ale in countless variations, creating a bustling network of social life impossible to imagine in the quiet lanes of the countryside. Vegetables in the city came from the surrounding fields, carried in baskets, piled onto carts, or sold by the handful on market days. The poor bought wilted greens late in the afternoon when prices dropped. Wealthier residents purchased fresh herbs, onions, leeks, carrots, and cabbage earlier in the day, sometimes buying enough to cook stews that simmered for hours in small kitchens above shops or behind workshops. Meanwhile, villagers in the countryside simply stepped into their gardens to pick what they needed, cutting leeks or pulling carrots with the quiet familiarity of people who knew every inch of their land. Meat revealed perhaps the greatest difference. In villages, meat came rarely: a pig slaughtered in autumn, a rooster cooked for a feast, a rabbit caught on the edge of the fields. But in cities, meat was part of daily commerce. Butchers' stalls displayed cuts of pork, beef, mutton, and goat, hung on hooks or laid on thick wooden boards. The wealthy purchased fresh cuts. The poor bought a fowl lungs, stomachs, feet, and bones to boil into soups or roast over small fires. The smell of butchers' districts was strong and unforgettable, mixing blood, smoke, and the voices of merchants shouting prices, while customers haggled over scraps. Fish, too, played a huge role in city diets, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden. Fishmongers shouted out the day's catch: herring, cod, eels, salmon, much of it salted or smoked to survive the journey from port towns. The wealthy ate fresh fish on the day it arrived. The poor bought the preserved varieties, boiling them again and again to soften their toughness. In villages far from the sea, fish came mostly from rivers, streams, or small ponds, modest in size and usually eaten the same day they were caught. What the city had that the village could never match was seasoning. Spices from distant lands, pepper, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, were sold in small quantities, precious enough to be kept in locked chests. These spices were rare, expensive, and used primarily by wealthy households, but they shaped the flavors of urban cooking in ways unthinkable for peasants. Even the middle-class craftsmen, merchants, clerks might afford pepper or ginger once in a while, adding a hint of luxury to a stew or pie. Street food was another hallmark of city life. Vendors sold hot pies filled with meat or onions, skewers of grilled fish, pancakes fried in animal fat, roasted chestnuts, or thick slices of bread dipped in broth. For those who worked long hours in workshops, smithies, or warehouses, these quick meals were a lifeline, eaten standing or sitting on steps, with the noise of the market swirling around them. In villages, by comparison, food was always eaten at home, around the hearth, in the soft quiet of a single shared room. Cities offered abundance, variety, and flavor, but they also carried danger. Bread might be adulterated with chalk or sand to increase profit. Meat could spoil quickly in crowded markets. Water was rarely clean, making ale essential. Villagers drinking from streams and wells faced far fewer risks. City life tasted sharper, stronger, richer, but also more uncertain. In the countryside, food reflected the cycles of nature. In cities, it reflected the cycles of trade and wealth. One world ate what their hands produced. The other ate what coins could buy. Yet both worlds, different as they were, depended intimately on one another. Without peasants, cities starved. Without cities, peasants had no markets, no tools, no spices, no news, and no place to sell their surplus. Two lives, two diets, one medieval world, bound together by bread, by hunger, and by the quiet hope that next season would be a little kinder. To truly understand medieval food, you must watch the countryside during the seasons when the land demanded everything from those who worked it. There were times of year, harrowing, sowing, haymaking, harvesting, when a peasant's life condensed into long hours beneath the open sky, when the body worked from dawn until dusk in a rhythm so relentless that the boundary between hunger and exhaustion blurred. In these seasons, food was no longer just sustenance, it was fuel, the quiet force that kept muscles moving, hands steady and spirits alive. What peasants ate during these intense periods reflected not luxury but necessity, a diet shaped by the sheer physical strain of feeding an entire medieval world. The mornings of hard labor seasons began earlier than usual, sometimes before the first light touched the horizon. Fields shimmered with dew, and the air carried a faint chill even in summer. Before leaving home, peasants ate a breakfast heavier than usual, coarse bread spread with thick butter or dripping saved from last autumn's slaughter, a slice of cold bacon if the family could spare it, or a bowl of warm pottage reheated from the previous night. Ale, mild and nourishing, washed it down. There was no lingering, no quiet conversation, only the quick, steady eating of people who knew the day ahead would be unforgiving. When the work truly began, cutting wheat with sickles, binding sheaves with twine, carrying bundles across the fields, or beating grain with flails, the appetite changed. Sweat soaked through wool tunics, muscles tightened and loosened in endless cycles, and the sun bore down on hunched backs. Energy left the body quickly, and so sometime mid-morning, often under the shade of a lone tree, or beside the edge of a hedgerow, workers paused for a small second meal called bait. This was a simple bite, bread dipped in ale, a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, or a handful of onions eaten raw. It lasted only minutes, but it gave just enough strength to push through until midday. The midday meal during harvest or heavy field labor was one of the most important meals of the entire year. Families and neighbors gathered together, forming a temporary feast in the middle of the fields. Women arrived carrying large clay or iron pots balanced on wooden yokes across their shoulders. The pots filled with thick pottage made from beans, peas, barley, carrots, and whatever vegetables were available. Sometimes the pottage steamed with the rich scent of salted pork added in small pieces, or the deeper aroma of bacon fat melted into the broth to give extra strength. Bread was cut into thick slabs and passed around, and ale was poured generously because dehydration was an enemy as real as hunger. Despite the simplicity, the atmosphere was warm. Dusty hands tore bread, tired backs leaned against sheaves of wheat, and laughter rose between mouthfuls. The food itself tasted of earth and effort, its warmth soaking into aching limbs. This meal not only nourished the body, it was a moment of human companionship in the middle of grueling labor. When the work resumed under the blazing afternoon sun, or the slow, suffocating heat trapped between tall grain, bodies began to tire again. In many villages, someone would bring a small afternoon snack, more bread, fruit, if the season allowed it, cold ale, or even a few handfuls of dried beans soaked earlier in water. Children, unable to match the adults in labor, ran errands bringing pitchers of ale from the cottage or carrying fresh water from the well, their small hands shaking from the weight. But the meal that mattered most during these periods came at sunset. After 12, 14, even 16 hours of work, peasants returned home with trembling muscles and throats dry from dust. The evening meal was the heaviest of the day, for now the body needed to recover enough strength to do the same work again tomorrow. Bread, cheese, more pottage, and sometimes roasted vegetables filled the table. If the harvest had been generous, a family might even celebrate with a small portion of meat, savoring each bite with a gratitude forged over years of scarcity. This was the food that built medieval Europe: bread, pottage, ale, cheese, onions, and whatever else the land could spare. It was not glamorous, but it was sturdy, warm, honest, full of the strength needed to swing tools, carry burdens, and endure long hours under the sun. The seasons of intense labor revealed something profound. Medieval peasants ate not for comfort, not for pleasure, but for endurance. Food was the invisible partner in their struggle, the quiet ally that supported every stroke of the sickle, every heave of the hayfork, every step across the fields. And at night, when the hearth glowed softly and families finally rested, the simple meal before them held a meaning deeper than taste. It was the assurance that they had survived another day and would rise again with enough strength to face the next. Winter was the great test of the medieval year, the silent force that shaped how people lived, what they ate, and how carefully they prepared during the warmer seasons. When snow pressed heavily against thatched roofs, and frost curled around cottage windows like white lace, survival depended on decisions made months before: what was planted, harvested, salted, smoked, dried, stored, and guarded from rot, fire, and hunger. In winter, the medieval diet became a carefully measured dance between scarcity and preservation, a slow unfolding of the foods that had been prepared with such effort during the bright months of the year. Inside a peasant cottage in January or February, the hearth glowed like the heart of the home, its coals pulsing with a quiet, enduring heat. Around it were signs of winter living: bunches of dried herbs hanging from rafters, braids of onions and garlic, twisting like ropes along the walls, sacks of barley and peas stacked in corners, and small bundles of salted pork hanging high above the fire, where the smoke curled lazily upward. Every object in that room told a story of preparation. Winter food was warm, heavy, and slow. It began and ended with pottage, the deep, sustaining stew of peas, beans, onions, dried vegetables, and small pieces of preserved meat. In winter, pottage thickened into something nearly solid, because water was precious to heat and fuel was limited. The pot rarely cooled fully. It simmered day after day, ingredients added gradually whenever a new handful of legumes or a strip of bacon could be spared. A medieval winter pottage was less a recipe and more a companion, always there, always changing, a living dish that carried the warmth of yesterday into tomorrow. Salted pork was the crown of winter preservation. In October and November, pigs were slaughtered because feeding them through winter was impractical. Women salted the meat with care, rubbing each piece thoroughly and packing it tightly into barrels or crocks. Throughout the cold months, families removed one small piece at a time, soaking it in water to pull out the excess salt before adding it to stew. A single chunk could flavor an entire pot, infusing peas and beans with rich, smoky warmth. Bacon strips hanging above the hearth hardened and darkened over the months, but they were priceless, tiny, edible embers of autumn stored for the darkest days. Root vegetables were winter's other treasure: turnips, carrots, parsnips, leeks, and cabbages were pulled from the soil before the first frost and stored in cool cellars or pits lined with straw. Each vegetable brought a different note to winter meals. The sweetness of carrots softened stews, leeks added depth, cabbages brought earthy strength. These vegetables lasted surprisingly long, but families used them carefully, slicing one parsnip across several meals, adding only half a cabbage to the pot so the other half could survive until spring. Bread, too, took on a different character in winter. Flour was rationed more strictly, and loaves grew darker and denser as families mixed grain with oats, bran, or even dried pulse flour. Winter bread was hardy, not soft, not airy, but filling. Often bread aged into hardness within days, requiring dunking in ale or broth to chew. This was not a flaw. It was a necessity, a way to make every crumb last. As for drinks, ale remained the standard, brewed last in late autumn and stored in cool barrels. Stronger than summer ales, winter brews warmed the body and kept morale steady in the long, silent months. Water was drunk when available, but in freezing weather, ale was easier to store than ice. Warm drinks were rare except for broths given to the sick or elderly. One of the most intense winter foods was gruel, a warm mixture of grains cooked with water or ale. It was simple, plain, and filling, exactly what a medieval family needed when the fire was small and fuel scarce. A bowl of hot gruel on a cold morning could mean the difference between strength and weakness, between endurance and exhaustion. Yet, not all winter foods were bleak. Some families made winter treats. If the harvest had been kind, apples dried or baked, nuts roasted over the fire, honey spread thinly on warm bread, or even small sweets flavored with herbs like mint or sage. These were rare, precious, shared slowly among children while snow fell outside. Winter also carried a strange beauty in its predictability. Meals were planned not by preference but by practicality, following a quiet rhythm. Pottage that grew deeper in flavor as the weeks passed. Bread that grew harder as the grain stores shrank. Vegetables that softened slowly in straw-lined pits. Meat that lasted only as long as the salt held it safe. Ale that warmed spirits when sunlight was scarce. And through it all, peasants depended on the knowledge passed down through generations, how to detect rot by smell alone, how to slice meat thin enough to stretch a week, how to dry herbs so their strength survived winter, how to ration without losing hope. Winter food was not rich, nor abundant, nor varied, but it was deliberate, comforting in its own quiet way, a small defiance against the cold. Every bowl warmed hands chapped by frost. Every bite carried memories of summer sun stored in grain and vegetables. Every meal reminded medieval families that they had survived another night and would survive another day, so long as the fire kept burning and the pot never emptied. In the medieval world, preserving food was not a choice, nor a craft hobby, nor a way to chase exotic flavors. It was a matter of survival so absolute that an entire household's fate could hinge on whether meat was salted properly, whether grains were kept dry, or whether a cellar stayed cool enough during the warm months. These techniques, passed down silently through generations, were woven into the daily rhythms of rural life and shaped the very taste of medieval food. To understand how peasants survived winter, hunger seasons, and unexpected hardships, one must step into the dim interior of a medieval cottage and watch how food was transformed, protected, and stored with almost ritualistic care. Salt, the guardian of meat. Salt was the first and most powerful weapon medieval people possessed against decay. Precious, expensive, and often transported over long distances, salt was used sparingly for seasoning, but lavishly for preservation. When a pig was slaughtered in autumn, the meat was cut into manageable pieces and rubbed thoroughly with coarse salt. Women worked methodically, pressing salt into every crevice, knowing that any missed patch could mean rot, waste, and hunger. The salted meat was then packed tightly into barrels or clay vessels, layered with more salt, and left to cure for days or weeks. This process drew moisture from the meat, hardened its texture, and allowed it to last through the long frozen months when fresh food was scarce. Salted pork was the backbone of winter, added sparingly to pottage or sliced thinly for special meals. The flavor was strong, sharp, and unmistakable, a taste shaped by necessity. Smoking, hanging food in the path of fire. If salt was the guardian, smoke was the watchful companion. In every cottage above the central hearth, darkened by soot and warm with rising heat, hung strips of bacon, sausages, fish, and occasionally cheese. Smoke curled upward day and night, slowly drying and flavoring the food. This method required almost no tools, only patience and steady fire. Over weeks, the meat darkened, hardened, and took on smoky undertones that made winter stews hearty and satisfying. Smoking wasn't simply for flavor. It protected the food from pests and mold, acting as a natural barrier. The hearth became a living preservation chamber, and a practiced medieval woman knew exactly how high to hang each cut, depending on how quickly she wanted it to cure. Drying, turning sunlight and air into preservation. Drying was the oldest and simplest method. Vegetables like beans, peas, onions, leeks, and herbs were hung in bunches from rafters where heat and air circulated freely. Fruits such as apples or plums were sliced and laid on racks to dry in the sun or inside warm ovens after baking days. Fish, especially herring and cod, were often dried outdoors on wooden frames until they became tough, leathery, and capable of lasting months. Dried foods were light, easy to store, and revived in stews, a small miracle in seasons when nothing fresh grew. Fermentation, the art that never stopped working. Fermentation ran quietly in every household. Ale was brewed in barrels, transforming grain into a nourishing drink that lasted longer than water. Cabbage and other vegetables were fermented into early forms of sauerkraut, especially in Central and Northern Europe, giving families a rare source of vitamins in winter. Even dairy played a part. Milk was churned into butter or fermented into buttermilk, cheese, or curds. These products were safer and more durable than fresh milk, which spoiled quickly. Fermentation was not seen as science. It was seen as rhythm, a stable, living process woven into daily life. Cellars and pits. The cold storage of the medieval world. Underground storage was essential. Many cottages had cellars, dark, cool, and stable, or dug pits lined with straw layers. These spaces protected root vegetables, apples, pears, onions, and turnips from frost. The earth kept temperatures constant, and the straw absorbed moisture. Families checked these stores weekly, removing anything that began to rot so it wouldn't corrupt the rest. Cellars smelled of earth, straw, and cold air, a quiet sanctuary for the winter months. Pickling vinegar as shield. Vinegar, usually made from spoiled ale or cider, was used to pickle vegetables. Carrots, onions, cucumbers, and even small fish could be submerged in vinegar and sealed in clay jars or wooden barrels. The sharp acidity prevented decay, extending the life of precious produce well beyond its natural season. Pickled foods were bright, tangy, and refreshing, a welcome contrast to heavy winter stews. Fat preservation, sealing food beneath tallow. Cold-cooked meats could be stored under a protective layer of fat. A pot of meat was covered with melted lard or tallow, which solidified into a barrier that kept oxygen and pests away. This method, known as potting, preserved cooked dishes for weeks or months. For many families, this was the only way to keep cooked meat safe. Herbs and knowledge, the invisible layer of protection. Knowledge was a preservation method in itself. Women knew which herbs discouraged pests, which bags kept grain dry, how to detect spoilage by smell, texture, or sound, and how to stack grains so that older supplies were used first. They knew that beans needed to dry fully to avoid mold, that garlic and onions needed airflow, that fruit must be wrapped in straw, and that salted fish must be soaked before cooking to remove excessive brine. The taste of preservation. Because of these methods, medieval food developed flavors we now think of as ancient salty meats, smoky bacon, earthy dried peas, tangy pickles, sun-dried fruits, fermented cabbage, ale with wild yeast, bread with the faint taste of stored grain. These flavors were the taste of survival, of patience, of time. Every preserved item carried a story of summer turned into winter comfort, of work saved for a future day, of skill that kept hunger at bay. Preservation was not an act but a way of life. It was how medieval people transformed the generosity of one season into the security of another, how they defeated the cold not with abundance but with preparation, and how they fed their families when the land lay silent beneath snow. If you lived in the medieval world, you carried an awareness that food, your single most important ally, could also turn into a threat. Without refrigeration, without airtight containers, without modern hygiene, the line between nourishment and illness was delicate, shifting, and sometimes invisible. Spoilage lurked in every corner, in damp sacks of grain, in barrels of salted meat, in vegetables stored in cool pits, in fish hung too close to the smoke, in cheese left too long, or in bread that had grown mouldy. And yet, medieval people were not helpless nor ignorant. They understood spoilage intimately, not through books but through generations of careful observation. The enemy of all food, moisture. Moisture was the great destroyer. Medieval women feared it the way we might fear fire or disease. A single damp sack of grain could breed mold, insects, or a wet rot that spread through the entire store. That was why grains were dried meticulously before being stored, stirred often, inspected regularly, and kept in sacks made of linen or cloth that allowed the contents to breathe. Barrels were checked for leaks. Meat hung above the hearth had to remain dry. Even one rainy week could reduce its quality. If moisture entered the cellar or if vegetables touched wet soil, rot spread quickly. Peasants learned to recognize the first softening of a turnip or the darkening of an onion's skin, the moment something failed the test. Too soft, too wet, too discolored, it was removed immediately. Better to lose one vegetable than a whole winter's store. Smell, the first warning. Scent was everything. Medieval people developed an astonishing sensitivity to smell because their survival depended on it. A woman could tell with one breath whether pork had been salted correctly, whether ale had spoiled, or whether fish had begun to sour. Fresh salted meat smelled sharp and briny. Spoiled meat carried a faint sweetness at first, an omen that disaster had begun. Rotten grain had an earthy, sour odor, unmistakable even to a child. Soured ale was sharp, acidic, and burned the nose. If the smell was wrong, the food was dangerous. Families did not gamble with this. Texture and sound. What hands and ears could tell. Hands, too, became tools of survival. A medieval woman would pinch a piece of fish to test how it yielded, feeling for the firmness that indicated safety. She would run her fingers across a slice of pork to feel whether the salt had done its work. She knew that grain should rattle dryly in its sack, and that beans should strike the bottom of a bowl with a clean, hard sound. Moist grains made a dull thud, proof they were beginning to spoil. Even bread spoke to the senses. A loaf that molded prematurely indicated trouble in the flour, humidity in the house, or insufficient baking. Mold could sometimes be scraped off, but if the bread felt damp or smelled fermented, it was offered to animals rather than eaten. Insects, vermin, and silent theft. Another danger was life, unwanted life. Insects nested in grain stores. Mice chewed through sacks. Rats found their way into cellars with cunning persistence. To medieval peasants, pests were not nuisances. They were existential threats. Cats were essential companions, not because of affection but because they guarded food. Dogs patrolled yards. Grain was hung from beams, stored high or placed inside sealed wooden chests to keep vermin out. Sometimes the warning came too late. A hollow rustle inside a grain barrel revealed that insects had taken root. The grain would be winnowed again, tossed into the air so the wind could blow away light debris, or dried in the sun. But deeply infested grain was bitter or musty and often unusable. Foodborne illness, the silent killer. Without knowing the modern science behind bacteria or toxins, Medieval people still recognized the unmistakable pattern when a meal tasted wrong or smelled odd, and someone fell sick afterward. The food was blamed. They saw how certain mushrooms killed quickly, how spoiled fish caused agony, how fermented stew could sicken a child, how reused cooking water sometimes caused diarrhea. Their cures were limited, herbal infusions, fasting, garlic, honey, but prevention was their real protection. Better to throw food away than bury a child. Better to feed a questionable loaf to pigs than risk poisoning the family. What was eaten, despite risk? Yet, hunger made people bold. In hard times, peasants sometimes ate things they normally avoided: wilted greens, sour cider, dried beans with spots, bread edged with mold. Even spoiled grain was sometimes salvaged by grinding it into flour and baking it into dense, strongly flavored bread. But everyone knew the danger. These foods were eaten only when the alternative was starvation. Knowledge as armor. At the heart of medieval food safety was knowledge, ancestral, unspoken, passed from parent to child. A medieval woman learned these rules not from books but from watching her mother lean over a pot, sniffing it intently, hearing her grandmother click her tongue at a soft onion, helping her father clear rot from a cellar, listening to elders whisper stories of mistakes made long ago. And thus, through hands and smell and instinct, medieval people kept themselves alive in a world where food could turn against them without warning. Spoilage was a constant companion, but it was also a teacher, shaping habits, storage methods, and the entire rhythm of survival. To eat safely in the Middle Ages was an art, as essential as growing the food itself. When you step back from the long journey through medieval fields and hearths, through seasons of abundance and months of hunger, through salted meat hanging in rafters and pottage simmering quietly in iron pots, you begin to see that medieval food was not merely nourishment. It was the heartbeat of an entire civilization, the quiet force that shaped daily labor, social bonds, faith, survival, and the very rhythm of life itself. A medieval peasant did not eat for pleasure, as we often do today. They ate to endure. They ate to rise with the dawn, to swing tools until their hands blistered, to pull the weight of a society built on their backs. Their food was simple: bread, ale, pottage, onions, herbs, dried beans, salted pork. But behind each of these ingredients stood countless hours of labor, careful planning, and ancestral knowledge. A loaf of barley bread carried the memory of ploughing, sowing, harvesting, grinding, kneading, and baking. A bowl of pottage carried the labor of tending gardens, preserving vegetables, and managing the household hearth. Even a sliver of bacon represented months of feeding a pig, days of salting, weeks of drying, and the restraint needed to make it last until spring. Their meals were reminders of the land, of community, of the silence between seasons. They tasted of the earth beneath their feet, the smoke above their hearths, the herbs growing wild at the edge of fields, and the steady patience passed from mother to daughter, father to son. Medieval food teaches us something profound. Life was lived slowly, attentively, and with deep respect for the natural world. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Every meal was earned, preserved, shared, and remembered. And in those small, dim cottages, lit by firelight, warmed by the breath of animals nearby, surrounded by the scent of herbs and bread, families gathered around bowls of steaming stew. They ate together not because they had much, but because they had each other. In a time when hardship was constant and comfort was rare, food became both anchor and refuge, the warm thread tying one day to the next. The medieval world survived because ordinary people transformed the simplest ingredients into strength. Strength for the fields, strength for the winter, strength for their families, strength for the future. And as the last ember of the hearth glowed softly in the nighttime dark, a medieval family lay down to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would begin again with bread, ale, and work. Their meals were humble, but they were enough. They fed a world, shaped a civilization, and carried humanity across centuries. In the end, medieval food is not just history, it is a story of resilience, patience, community, and the quiet beauty of survival.